Welcome to the Workplace Podcast in association with Dynamic Partners. We've got an incredible guest today, and we're really excited for the insights and ideas they'll be sharing. There are so many practical learnings from this conversation that will make a difference to you, your team, or your organization. Whether you're navigating leadership challenges, building high-performing teams, or driving organizational change, today's episode is something valuable for you. If your organization is interested in exploring this topic further or would benefit from a workshop, feel free to get in touch via our website, dynamicpartners.ie. Now, let's start the conversation.
Welcome to the Workplace Podcast. Today's topic is disruptive innovation. Joining us today to discuss his book, Epic Disruptions, is Scott D. Anthony. Scott is a clinical professor of strategy at Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth College, where his research and teachings focus on disruptive change. He's previously spent more than 20 years at Innovate, a growth strategy consulting firm, co-founded by Harvard Business School professor Clayton Christensen. Scott's latest book is Epic Disruptions, 11 Innovations that Shaped Our Modern World. His previous books include Seeing What's Next, The Little Black Book of Innovation, Dual Transformation, and Eat, Sleep, Innovate. He has been nominated for Thinkers 50 Innovation Awards no less than 4 times, winning in 2017. In 2025, Thinkers 50 named him the world's 5th most influential management thinker. Scott has a BA in economics from Dartmouth College, an MBA from Harvard Business School, and an executive master's in change from INSEAD. Scott, welcome to the Workplace Podcast.
William, it is fantastic to be here with you. I'm just crossing my fingers that there are as many sticky notes in Epic Disruptions as there were in the other books I saw you carrying at the Thinkers 50 Gala in November last year.
Well, I can definitely tell you this has got the sticky note treatment. We got to meet each other at Thinkers 50. You were great on stage. I really enjoyed meeting you. And you met me when I was just meeting the other podcast guests. So a big shout out to them: Amy Gallo, Maura Aaron Meles, Francis Fry, Muriel Wilkins, Anne Morris. And I have to say, just like their books, I really liked this book. And I'm going to tell our listeners why I like this book. So this book is witty, it's entertaining, and it's educational. This is where business, strategy, innovation, history, and humor overlap. And I really enjoy learning so many quirky facts, like Gorilla Glass, like Florence Nightingale used graphs and charts to influence people and politics, how gunpowder started off centuries ago in China as magic tricks derived from pig manure. Hopefully I got that right. The story of Sony and how it came about, how Transistor started the technology revolution, how Intel was formed, how Julia Childs, for example, the famous cook, was a spy. And this is the biggest compliment I'll give you, and I said this just beforehand, is my wife saw me reading this book at Christmas, and she says, "Why are you reading workbooks at Christmas? Why are you not switching off?" And I says, honestly, I am enjoying this book so much. So I love the footnotes in that. I love the questions at the back. And speaking of footnotes, I enjoy your little stories about your sons. They sound like great fun. And lastly, what I'll say is your writing style is very much like Malcolm Gladwell. So if you like learning, having fun about innovation, history, and strategy, then this is the book for you. So how about that, Scott?
Well, I kind of feel like we should just stop here, because I can only go down after all those nice things. But I'm very, very grateful for everything you've said. It was a joy to write, and I've been glad to see the way that people have received it. It was fun, and what you have described is what exactly I was aiming for. So I'm really, really pleased to hear it.
Well, my experience of you, Scott, is fun. I saw you on stage. I saw you at the Black Tie event. I saw you at our coffee meetings. I really enjoyed your company, and I think our listeners will too. So let's begin. So what is innovation?
So the definition that I use for innovation, I try to keep it short. I define it as something different that creates value. And you can break that phrase into 2 parts. Something different is very purposefully vague because that gives room for lots of different kinds of innovation, hypersonic planes and day-to-day things that make the world just a little bit better. Both count. Creates value reminds us that innovation is different from its inputs, things like invention and creativity, which are critically important, of course. But until you are earning revenues or making customers more satisfied or making employers happier or whatever, in my mind, you have not innovated. It is the translation of that spark into value that is the essence of innovation. So that is the definition that I use, something different that creates value.
So why disruptive innovation? Like disruptive seems awkward. It seems, this is not comfortable. Like why disruptive innovation then? Why should we be thinking in that way?
Is disruptive innovation is then a subcategory of innovation, and they're the things that are really worth paying attention to. So let me just describe disruption using a quick story about my family history, and then I'll talk about why it's so important to understand. My father was born in 1947, and in 1947, there was count them, one computer in the world. My father would never see it. It was big, complicated, cumbersome, and expensive. I was born in 1975. Now, there are tens of thousands of computers in the world. Still, I would not see them because they're tucked away inside large corporations that have experts that can use them. You mentioned my sons in the footnotes. I have 3 sons. I also have a daughter. My daughter Holly was born in 2007. Now, there are hundreds of millions of computers. They're on desktops, they're in laptops, and of course, that was the year that Steve Jobs and team launched the iPhone. Today, there are billions of computers in the world, in our pockets and in our palms. That's disruptive innovation. Taking things that once were complicated and expensive, making them simple and affordable, changing market dynamics, driving explosive growth. And that's why it's so important to understand disruption, because those are the innovations that truly transform the world. And as we understand the dynamics of them, we can understand how our world today can change. So my mission in Epic Disruptions is to give readers timeless stories that gives them fiercely urgent lessons about what we're going through right now.
And what I liked about it is you really educate us in different, not just what innovation is and why it's important then, but you talked about the different types of innovation. We just talked about innovative disruptive there, and then the innovator's dilemma. So do you mind if we talk about types of innovation and then the innovator's dilemma?
So types of innovation, there's lots of ways to categorize innovation, but if you start with disruption, you are generally starting with the research of the late, great Harvard Business School professor, Clayton Christensen, who at one point in my life I called my teacher, my boss, my colleague, my co-author, my mentor, and most critically, my friend. Sadly passed away in 2020, way too young. He was 67 years old. His original research said, in essence, there are 2 types of innovation. There are those innovations that sustain, so take what currently exists and make it better along dimensions that historically matter to people. And there are those innovations that disrupt, that redefine what performance means, that might offer, in fact, lower performance along dimensions that historically mattered, but bring new benefits. They're simpler, they're cheaper, they're more accessible, etc. The innovator's dilemma. We teach our students in our MBA program in most classes that you listen to your best customers, you innovate to meet their needs, you produce the best products in the market, you seek high margin opportunities, you seek the biggest profit pools, and that is a recipe for success most of the time. When a disruptor comes and changes the game, however, the recipe for success turns into a dilemma, a recipe for disaster. You do everything you're supposed to do, and you miss the great big disruptive shift. Take, for example, talking about the Apple iPhone. Nokia played its game brilliantly. It continued to take its phones and make its phones smaller, make its phones more portable, make its phones have batteries that lasted longer, make its phones make even more reliable phone calls because that's what its customers wanted. Research in motion, BlackBerry. It made email even better. It made the keyboard even more ergonomic. It competed very effectively along the dimensions that historically mattered. But when Apple and later Google with the Android operating system said, no, 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 this isn't about a phone, this is about a computer in your pocket, they failed to make that transition because it's really hard to play yesterday's game and tomorrow's game at the same time. That is the innovator's dilemma. You do what you're supposed to do. It all looks good until it doesn't.
So just on that, because sometimes there's myths about what went on in Nokia and a Revolution in Motion and BlackBerry, and it's down to maybe value proposition where they were more focusing more on the user experience. Like you talked about the ergonomic keyboard with BlackBerry, and you talked about the smaller phone with Nokia. Is this a myth where there was overconfidence in their market share, or was it that they should have let go of the user experience and focus more about how it could be deployed in the future as like a computer in your pocket?
So this is where things get really juicy. There's no easy answer to these things. And
Yeah.
you go back to Clay Christensen's research, he asked a delicious question. His question was, what is it that causes smart, well-run companies to fail? Think about that for a second. What causes a dumb, poorly run company to fail? That's pretty obvious. It's dumb and poorly run. A smart, well-run company that's doing what it seemingly should do, why they fail, that's really interesting. So if you look at those two examples, there's two things that I would highlight. The first is something that I teach my students the very first day of class. It's got a bit of a wonky name, but I call it the information action paradox. The challenge is by the time the data are clear, it's too late to act based on the implications of the data. So in 2007, when the iPhone comes out, it's a great time if you're Nokia or Research in Motion because the iPhone is a niche phone. It's not a mass market thing overnight. So your market share looks good, your stock price is going up. You're not getting a signal that this is existential until it's too late to do anything about it. That's one large challenge. The second is for the mainstream incumbent, this is not an either or battle. This is not should we go and defend today or create tomorrow. They have to do both of those things, but those are very different activities. Inside today's business, you've got a well-honed set of processes, you've got approaches, you even have an ethos, a spirit, a culture. All of those things are great, but they create very deep and hidden barriers if you're trying to do new things. And we could geek out about psychology at this stage, but I'll just say at this point, the problem to address the innovator's dilemma runs incredibly deep, which means it is a really hard thing for executives to grapple with. And I have a lot of sympathy for organizations that succumb to it because I've been there. I spent 20 years advising companies, and you might have the right answer on paper, but actually doing it inside a large, complex organization where someone's going to win and someone's going to lose, and everybody's going to struggle because they have to relearn and unlearn a bunch of stuff. That's really hard stuff.
Yeah, and what I liked about the BlackBerry piece was it was about their value proposition was all about security, and that's why they were holding their market share for so long against the iPhone.
And that's what their customers wanted. So their customer is not
Yeah.
you and me at the time. It's a chief technology or chief information officer at a big company. And you're Jim Balsillie, the co-CEO at the time. You go to a customer, you say, would you like a phone that you cannot control, that is a bandwidth hog, that people have to learn new behavior? No, I don't want that. I want your phone, Jim. And I'd like a little bit of a price break on it. Can you make it more secure, make it easier to manage, blah, 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 blah. But your best customers give you the worst signals when a big disruptive change is afoot because they don't want it at first.
Yeah. And that's what happened. Then the security hack happened, and then their value proposition diminished, and then its floodgates nearly opened then for Android and iPhone to come in. I thought that was just a fascinating piece. So is there common misconceptions then about innovation in workplaces then? Is there things that people just generally struggle with when it comes to innovation?
There's many things. So, I'll just start with a couple. One is that innovation is done by mythical people who have superpowers. And you read through the stories in the book. Of course, there are great people in the stories, but they're normal people who achieve extraordinary results by doing a certain set of things. They're curious, they're collaborative, they're experimental. That's not that hard. So the actual behaviors that drive disruptive success are not super challenging. So that's a myth that you need to have a superhero, Steve Jobs reincarnated or whatever to do it. I think another big one that I would highlight is that disruption is a bad thing. I mean, the word itself, disruption, kind of want to spit it out and you curl your mouth a little bit. But disruption is an engine of progress and growth. And when you harness the power of disruption, it can be a great way to make people's lives better, to create new growth for your organization, et cetera, et cetera. That's a myth that I think you have to overcome. Then the third one, and there's many more, but I will stop after three. I'm going to talk out of both sides of my mouth. Those who are big believers in disruption, and look, I'm one of them. I have written about, I've advised, I've built, I really believe, they will tell you that this is an unvarnished good. Disruption drives progress. Disruption creates big growth, but disruption also always casts a shadow. There is a downside to disruption. There is a dark side to disruption. You don't understand that, it can get you into a lot of trouble. So again, there's a lot of other misconceptions that we could talk about, but those are at least a few of the ones I explore in the book and beyond.
If this conversation has you thinking about getting better at conflict in your team, now is a good time to act on it. Resolution intelligence helps leaders bend the arc of conflict toward healthy resolution, navigating challenges with confidence and saving time, money, and relationships. Visit resolution-intelligence.com to get your personal resolution intelligence report and take the first step.
So some people, when they think about innovation, they'll go, well, that's somebody that should be in a lab or somebody that's an expert in a certain area. What do you think about innovation should be everybody's responsibility in the organization?
Well, so let me explain why, and then let me tell a story just to cement it. So, again, back to the definition. Innovation is something different that creates value. When we try to say only a very few people can and should do that, we miss a huge opportunity in our organization to go and improve the day-to-day, to give our employees better experiences, give our customers or consumers better experiences, et cetera, et cetera. So we're leaving huge amounts of value on the table when we make innovation the job of the few. Also, innovation, when done well, it's a lot of fun to explore new things and try new things. So to me, it's very intrinsically motivating when you allow people to do it. And then the final thing, and this will tie to a story, again, it's easier than people think. So, one of my favorite chapters in the book is the chapter on Julia Child. And you mentioned the fun fact that she worked with the predecessor to the CIA before she met, or actually when she met her husband, Paul Child. So she was a spy, or at least related to the spying business before she was a chef. But here's the thing that really strikes me about Julia Child. She shows up in France in the late 1940s. She's not a great cook. She was not born a great cook. Nobody is. She fell in love with the idea of cooking. She worked hard. She failed her first exam at Le Cordon Bleu. She started working on her book in 1951. The book came out in 1961. Lots of setbacks and struggles along the way. Through it all, Julia Child was intensely curious. She was really good at collaborating with co-authors and other chefs. She experimented like you could not believe to try and come up with recipes. She was really good at putting herself in the shoes of the end reader of the recipes. For example, you break open a cookbook, you see that the ingredients are on one side of the page, the recipe is on the other. That's a Julia Child special. The books weren't done that way until she said, I want to make it easy for people to cook. Those behaviors, being curious, being collaborative, running experiments, putting yourself in the shoes of customers, that's not rocket science. Julia Child, of course, achieved extraordinary things. I don't think you can argue or should argue that she was an extraordinary person. She was a normal person that did extraordinary things. That capability is in anyone, I fiercely believe.
I genuinely loved reading all of these historical characters. And one of or should I say people, they're not characters. And one of them then was Florence Nightingale. So it's not just about innovation. Does it have to be a tech breakthrough? So what can we learn from the likes of Florence Nightingale then? And then I mentioned about the bar charts or the graphs.
Yeah, and you hit the nail on the head where it's not just about technology. Here's the very short version of the Florence story. Florence from Florence is the name of the chapter. She was from Florence, born in Florence, Italy in 1820. In the 1830s, she tells her parents God has called her to a life of service as a nurse. Her parents say, can you please not return that call? Because nursing is at the time a lower class profession. But like any great innovator, Florence Nightingale is very persistent. She ultimately gets trained as a nurse. She goes and serves at the Scutari Hospital during the Crimean War in modern day Turkey and encounters just horrific conditions. And she learns the worst place to be is not on the battlefield, it's in the hospital because you've got open sewage and foul air and infectious diseases are spreading like crazy. She sends a telegraph back to London, says, we need people to clean the hospital up. They come, they clean the hospital up. The rate of infectious diseases goes way down. She then goes back to London, meets the Queen. The Queen puts her on a royal commission to look at the state of military hospitals. This is when she starts to innovate, and her innovation is not technological. She works with William Farr from the General Registry Office, and they go, in modern terms, and crunch the numbers and come up with these really stunning visuals. It's called a polar area chart or the Rose diagram that make it very clear what was going on. One historian called the visuals interocular. They hit you between the eyes. Once you see them, you can't unsee them. And what you see is, like I said before, the worst place to be was not the battlefield. It was the hospitals until modern hygiene standards were put in, and then the hospitals got a lot better. Those visuals had huge impact. Florence Nightingale kept doing different things. She wrote books, notes on nursing. She created a teaching hospital to train people in the methodology. Nightingales, trained in her approach, flew through the world. Ultimately, the UK passed a number of public health standards that we take for granted today. Life expectancies start shooting up. Florence Nightingale, of course, is not the only reason this happened. We've got modern medicine and a bunch of things, but she played a big role in the story. There's a little bit of technology in the fringes about how the data was crunched, but really, it's visuals, it's teaching, it's training. Those are things that, when brought together, you can use to drive huge system change, and you need not know anything about technology. So Florence Nightingale shows us that innovation comes in lots of forms and flavors. And again, anyone with the right mindset and approach can have that kind of impact.
Isn't that so heartening there? Because we're going to be entering times, or we're actually in times where it's very volatile, right? There's a lot of disruption going on, a lot of innovation needed. And how do we change, depending on the context? And this is what it's really good then about those points that you make then is there's a part of this where we need to teach, we need to communicate, and we need to visualize, okay, well, if this is the future strategy here, and this is how we can get people on board then, because that's the piece that you make then in this book then is we fear change. It's like that identity loss that happens, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I brought this up in the back half of, I always say one of my favorite chapters. There's only 11 chapters, so they're all my favorite chapters. But, the Bethlehem Steel chapter I thought was really fun just because I took one of Clay Christensen's favorite stories about how the mini mills disrupted the integrated steel mills, and I flipped it around. I looked at it through the eyes of the incumbent, and I said, when you do that, you see very clearly one of the invisible but very persistent barriers to change, something that I call ghosts. In the case of Bethlehem Steel, the ghost that you're highlighting here is the fear of identity loss, where when you are going through a big disruptive change, you're going from one state to another. And that might be conceptually attractive, but if you really personally associate with the from state, if you work for an automobile company and you have always gotten your hands dirty working on engines that spit out oil, and then all of a sudden you're doing software and electrical things, there's a part of your soul that doesn't like that. Bethlehem Steel, by all rational accounts, should have shut down its plant in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and focused on other things. But how could it do that? Because Bethlehem is the name of the company. It's inextricably tied to place and space. So there's a lot about innovation. As much as I love it and as much as I think it's good, you have to realize that there are internal barriers, whether it's fear of identity change or what's known by behavioral psychologists as the status quo bias. All things being equal, we would like things to stay exactly the way they are now, that we have to overcome if we're going to grapple with all of the in-process disruptions that are taking place right now. One of the great things, last thing I'll say here, one of the things that I think I really appreciate, you mentioned my kids have no fear of new things because they're kids. So I just jump in the deep end with them and say, all right, let's screw around with this, that, and the other. And they teach me about AI and crypto and mixed reality and all that, because to them, it's all new and it's all fun.
And I have to say, people should really follow you on LinkedIn, because I love your LinkedIn posts where you share so many different little stories there. Now, one of the stories that I liked as well, you just mentioned automobile there, and that reminds me of vertical integration and Henry Ford's 29 steps. So sometimes it's a process that needs to be reviewed as well, isn't it? Can you tell us a little bit about vertical integration and Henry Ford?
There's so much that we could talk about with Henry
Yeah,
Ford.
yeah.
Again, it's one of my 11 favorite chapters, but the shortest version of the story. So Henry Ford had a vision and he was obsessed with the vision. The vision was create the car for the multitudes, make it affordable so broader populations could drive. Classic disruption. Take expensive and complicated things, make them simple and affordable. He didn't get it right at first. He had two companies that he formed and then left. One he was fired from, one he quit. The third was the Ford Motor Company. Then the car that ultimately broke through, we know, is the Model T. Henry Ford liked his letters, so there was A, B, C, D, E, dot, dot, dot. He didn't have all of them, but he had a lot of them. And the Model T in 1908, when it came out, while it was a technological marvel, was not the car for the multitudes, because in today's terms, it was 30,000 US dollars. So we know what happens next. There's the assembly line. What's interesting about the assembly line is Ford did not pioneer it. A bunch of people were playing around with it. It's a lot of combinatorial technologies, which you see as a very common theme, people bringing things together. He was the one that perfected it, having those 29 steps. A car went from 14 hours to construct to 93 minutes, really nailed it. But that was only the beginning of the story. Problem: for an assembly line to really work, you needed people who had experience. Bruce Henderson would later teach people about the experience curve, and the more you work on something, the faster you do it. But turnover was more than 100% a year. Workers were coming and going, and because of that, they weren't getting experience. So Ford did something that at the time people said was crazy. He dramatically increased wages. Now, there's a lot of historical debate about this. Some say that he was doing it out of benevolence. Some say that he was doing it for business reasons. I'm in that side, because turnover after this went way down. The experience curve kicks in, the price of the car goes way down. By the early 1920s, it's 5,000 US dollars per car. The car for the great multitudes has finally arrived. Technology is involved. There's a new business process. There's a new managerial ethos that enables it to happen. Almost always, when you see a big disruptive shift, it's not a single thing. It's not a silver bullet. It's a bunch of stuff that is coming together. And that's only half of the Model T story. We could talk about what happened in the streets of New York in the 1920s if we wanted to, but many other things we could talk about as well.
And that's the thing about innovation. There's an ecosystem around it. So we're talking about change management. We're talking about systems and processes. We're talking about what leaders and managers are rewarding. And then you mentioned it earlier on, because if a senior leader is listening in here, or someone that has responsibility in HR over talent development, then you were talking about some behaviors then. And I like this in the book. You had talked about the innovators' DNA research and your own fieldwork about those 5 behaviors that drive innovation success. So you have curiosity, you talked about, customer obsession, collaboration, adeptness in ambiguity, and empowerment. And I think, especially in the times that we're coming in now, these are something that we really need to add to our systems behaviors, aren't they?
I totally agree. And here's the thing, William. These behaviors are not things that require specialized skills. You listen to them, you say, yeah, those seem pretty straightforward. In fact, again, back to my kids, I don't teach any of those behavior to my kids. They're kids. Kids are curious. Kids very naturally collaborate. Kids are very good at being adept in ambiguity and experimenting and all that. And empowerment, no shortage of that. Customer obsessed. Yeah, there might be a little bit of put yourself in someone else's shoes and all that.
Yeah.
But for the most part, these are very natural behaviors that we enter the world dripping in them, but we unlearn them when we go to school and are told right answers and wrong answers, and go to work and told there's ways we do things and ways that we don't do things. I don't talk about it in this book, but my previous book, Eat, Sleep, Innovate, there was this one moment that changed the course of a bank in Singapore, DBS Bank. So let me tell you the story. So DBS Bank was on a mission where it really was trying to create a culture of innovation and digital and AI and all that good stuff. And they were going and looking at companies that seemingly had it right. So they're going to visit Netflix. And someone from DBS starts to complain, says, it's all well and good what you're saying, but you have it easy. You just hire these young, sharp engineers out of West Coast US schools. We don't have access to that talent. Then the person at Netflix said, well, let me ask you a question. How old is your average engineer? The person at DBS said, 40. The person at Netflix said, ours too. In fact, many of the engineers that we hire are from banks just like yours. We just get out of their way. That line, we just get out of their way, changed the way the DBS thought about things. It thought its problem was bringing talent in. It realized its problem was the organization itself, that it was constraining and containing the huge innovation energy that already existed in the organization if it could get out of their way. And it did, and had great results and all that good stuff.
If this conversation has you thinking about getting better at conflict in your team, now is a good time to act on it. Resolution intelligence helps leaders bend the arc of conflict toward healthy resolution, navigating challenges with confidence and saving time, money, and relationships. Visit resolution-intelligence.com to get your personal resolution intelligence report and take the first step.
Speaking about customer obsession, then, I thought this is one of the best stories. It's the story about Pampers and the 10-cent diaper. So this is a slight Irish connection through Gamble, the Irish guy of Procter and Gamble. Can you tell us a little bit? I think that's brilliant, because the story, from what I remember, is diapers were only used when families were traveling. And that SWAT is connected then as well a little bit later on, if we can talk about that. That's the skills, wealth, access, and technology.
Time.
Sorry. So close.
There's a lot of acronyms and a lot of little chestnuts in there.
I think that is brilliant, because it was like, how do we solve this? Because it's like, how do we solve this for the customer? And how do we create a new market? And they just dominated the market once they solved this.
And the thing that I always appreciated about Procter and Gamble, and full disclosure, I consulted pretty closely to Procter and Gamble in the first decade of the 2000s. I guess we call it the aughts. So I know the company unusually well. And one of the things P&G is just incredibly good at doing, looking at the world through the eyes of the consumer. And that's what happened in the 1950s. 1954, Vic Mills, a very established scientist within P&G, is tapped on the shoulder and said, we want you to go and help to give birth to new product lines. 1956, he asked Bob Duncan to go after diapers, to go after nappies, you might call it in many countries. Part of the reason was Vic Mills' own connection to the problem. So he had just become a grandfather, and he saw cloth diapers, which most people use, were a mess, and disposable diapers, which 90% of U.S. households had at least one of, were never used because the product quality was so bad. So he said, well, P&G, we are all about affordable convenience. We've already done the wash day miracle with Tide. We had the soap that floats back in the 1860s with Ivory. We're just beginning to roll out Crest toothpaste, the first fluoride-based toothpaste that dentists recommend. So we're really good at doing this. Let's do it with diapers. Now, problem, it's not actually technologically that easy to do. So to come up with something that you can dispose of that doesn't harm a baby's skin and you can make affordable is really hard. But P&G was convinced it was a problem worth solving. So when it failed the first test market, the second test market, and the third test market, it didn't stop, because each time it learned. The first test market was a technological failure. They had these two-part diapers. They tested it in the state of Texas in the United States in the month of August. One researcher said, maybe we should not have succumbed babies to a Turkish bath. Maybe that was our problem, but the technology didn't work. The second test market failure was a failure of pricing. They were aiming for 10 cents a diaper, but they realized they actually had to not have something that was at par with other disposable diapers, but something that was a lot cheaper to drive adoption. So they said, we got to change everything to do that. Third failure was marketing. We've got the technology, we've got the pricing, but we haven't figured out exactly how to communicate to the consumer. All along the way, through 8 years of failures, they said a problem worth solving demands persistence and attention. Finally launched it nationally in the US in 1965, begin rolling it out globally. It becomes the biggest brand P&G has ever created. Today, more than $10 billion in revenues a year. That persistence over a problem that matters, well, you don't see a better example of customer or consumer obsession than that, I think.
8 years for that. Like, would that be tolerated in this day?
I get that question a lot. And,
Yeah.
my answer is yes, in the right circumstance. So, as a modern example of this, the Apple iPhone comes out in 2007. But that was not the first year of the Apple iPhone. Arguably, it was at least the 11th, because in the mid 1990s, Apple shut down the Apple Newton, which actually
Yeah.
traces back to probably development in the 1980s, which essentially was the Apple iPhone before the technology was ready.
Yeah.
So I think that's an example of Apple saying, hey, the problem of bringing computing to ever more convenient locations is a problem we're solving. The Apple Newton as a particular approach didn't work, but that doesn't mean we should stop working on it. So, the Apple iPhone turns 20 next year. So, maybe that's still an old example, but I don't think it's that old. So I think you have examples of companies that say this problem is still worth solving, therefore we will persevere. I am curious, in modern times, Facebook, now renamed Meta, has gotten a lot of bad press because it invested so much in the metaverse and then wrote a lot of that down. I don't think Mark Zuckerberg and team were wrong. I think the metaverse, mixed reality, is going to be a huge space. I just think the timing and the technology wasn't there. Interested to see what happens in the next 10 years. Is there the equivalent of the Apple iPhone that comes out that we can wind back the clock and say Zuckerberg and team were there? They were just there too early. I don't know. We will see.
Speaking about too early, and product failures and tech failures, and I'm glad you mentioned actually the Newton, because didn't Steve Jobs, that was one of the factors where they got kicked out of Apple nearly for that being a failure, and then they got him back in a couple of years later. But talk about sitting on something that's an asset. You've solved something, is Gorilla Glass. I love this example there. And by the way, it took decades for this to pay off.
Decades, 5+ decades, and it's such a fun little story, isn't it? So the way that I will use it when I'm with audiences, I'll hold up my iPhone and I'll say, how old is this? And some people say, well, the first one 2007. I say older. They say, well, development probably started. I say older. Some people will say the Apple Newton. I say older. Some people will go back to Marconian wireless technologies. I say I didn't want to go back quite that far, but I bring them to 1952. 1952 is when Don Stuckey, a chemist at Corning, a company that does things related to glass, has an experiment that goes wrong. He sets the kiln to too high a temperature. He thinks he's going to have this huge mess, but he creates this really interesting composite material that can withstand heat, but still has a lot of properties of glass. Corning has one branch where they go and commercialize this in a bunch of cooking ware that I'm sure everybody has a version of it in their kitchen. And then says, okay, we want to have another development effort where we make it transparent like glass and use it as a glass replacement. Problem in the early days, they couldn't make it thin. So they looked for an application where they could have something that was a big surface area and it didn't matter if it was thin or not. I said, well, what about the windshields of cars? Problem. The solution is 14 times stronger than glass. So when they ran tests with crash test dummies, the head did not withstand the impact with the windshield. No humans were harmed in this, thankfully, but they shut it down. 1971, Project Chemcore gets shut down. Total cost of about $300 million, but it didn't really get shut down. Corning chemists kept tinkering away. Can we make it thinner? Can we make it thinner? Can we make it thinner? In the early 2000s, Motorola comes up with its Razr flip phone. They're looking for a thin material to put on the screen, and they go and use this glass that Corning has. In 2007, months before the iPhone comes out, Steve Jobs takes a trip to Corning, New York to meet Wendell Weeks, the CEO, and says, I want you to do this. I want you to do it at a size bigger than you've ever done before and volumes bigger than you've ever done before, and I want it in 6 months. And Wendell Weeks said, we can do all of those things, but not at that pace, not at that size, not at that scale. And reality distortion field, Steve Jobs turns it on, doesn't blink, and says, you can do it. You will do it. And lo and behold, Corning actually does it. And every screen in the world today now has this Gorilla Glass on it. Billions of screens, an overnight success, 55 years in the making. It's a great story.
It Your book is full of these stories. I'm going to give stories about AWS, McDonald's. There's so many things there. And why I mentioned those two stories about McDonald's and their approach to strategy, and I think you mentioned it at the top of the program. So their special sauce was the unique way that McDonald's created value for their customers, delivered that value to those customers, and captured a portion of that value themselves. So you mentioned in the book about the potato computer, Hamburg University, how they laid out the kitchens, I think, in tennis courts there, just to see how the operating line will work. Your book is full of these. And then it's the long-term strategy, for example, like AWS, which started as something very small and now is reaping huge dividends. Now, we kind of alluded to this before, that in today's world, there's very much short-termism that goes on. Like, how do we protect against that? Or and we talk about emergent strategy, like how do we make sense of this in the world that we are today?
I think the way that we make sense of it along some kind of paradoxical dimensions is we lean into it and we recognize it's the reality. It's a lesson I learned from Clark Gilbert. So Clark Gilbert was the co-author of my 2017 book, Dual Transformation, along with Mark Johnson, a former Insight colleague of mine. One of the things that Clark talked about, let me back up, the book, Dual Transformation. It says, disruption strikes your industry. If you're a market leader, the way you have to respond is through dual transformation. Transformation, fundamental change in form or substance. You're becoming the next version of yourself. Dual, you're not doing one thing, you're doing two. You're reinventing today, transformation A. You're creating tomorrow, transformation B. And the book is really two books in one. So Mark and I represent consultants that have case studies and frameworks and tools and all that. Clark Gilbert, the co-author, represents an actual business leader who did this at a media organization and did it again at a university. One of the lessons I learned from Clark is a mistake people make when they're working on big, bold, new disruptive things is they think they have a get out of jail free card. It's like, we don't have to deliver results. We can just go and experiment and run tests and there's no time, whatever. And he said, that's not right at all. You have to deliver results when you're working on new things because there are so many forces inside an organization that want to shut down. If you're a university going online, if you're a legacy print newspaper creating a digital community, that you have to give proof points that what you're working on has value. Now, importantly, Clark would say, that doesn't have to be earning. It does have to be learning. So if you go back to the Procter & Gamble example, yes, 8 years of failure along one dimension, which is hitting revenue and profit targets, but 8 years of success along another dimension, removing the key risk behind the idea, figuring out what is the technology that will work, what is the price point that will work in a marketplace, how do we build manufacturing in order to do that, how do we market, check, 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 check. Had P&G been making no progress, of course, you should shut that sucker down. But by demonstrating that it was learning and advancing, you put wins in the sails to continue to push forward. So again, lean into the short-termism, deliver results, but be really thoughtful about the results you're seeking and how you're measuring new things. That is how you get yourself out of this conundrum, I think.
So if I'm a senior leader in an organization, when it comes to innovation, what advice would you give me if I'm like, okay, I need to be more innovative and like the pressure's on?
A lot. The Dual Transformation is book number 9. So I'm sorry. Yeah. Epic Disruptions is book number 9. Dual Transformations was number 7. Read all the books. But no, seriously, there's a lot of things a senior leader has to do. I think if you step way, 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 way back from it, it is above all else, it is a mindset. It is a mindset of optimism, a mindset of potential, what Carol Dweck would call a growth mindset, a mindset of possibility, one that says, we as an organization are capable of doing amazing things. And to realize that capability, we have to be different from the organization that we are today. So within that optimism, there is a discontent saying that the status quo that we have now cannot be the right approach to win in the future. So yes, I believe, and I'm also skeptical about our ability to do it right now, which means I got to agitate and I've got to change things because that's what innovation is all about. I think if you start with that mindset that I see the possibility and I recognize the limitations, then a lot of other things you do afterwards, allocating resources in the right way, setting up the right systems inside organizations. I don't actually worry too much about incentives, but making sure there's not penalties when things go wrong in the right way, whatever. There's a bunch of other stuff you have to do. But if you don't have the mindset to begin with, you're never going to do all those things right. Andy Grove, legendary Intel CEO, was famous for saying, only the paranoid survive. My 2026 modification for that is, and only the optimistic thrive. So yes, perceive the threat, that's real, and also recognize and realize the opportunity.
And if there's younger listeners listening in here, and I want to make a difference in the workplace, and I want to be more innovative, what advice would you give to me?
A few different things I'd say. I'd say number one of the things that you will often see when people talk about innovation, I mentioned it once, this idea of combinations. Innovation happens at intersections when different backgrounds and mindsets collide. So the more a younger person gets a diverse set of experiences and therefore has different lenses and mental models and stories that they can draw on, the easier it will be for them to see new possibilities. So get as many different experiences as you can. Number two, as awesome as I think AI is, and I really do think it's awesome, make sure that you still develop your ability to think critically and develop wisdom. The metaphor that I use is a number of young people go to gyms and they get on treadmills and they lift weights and they're trying to fine tune their bodies. I could bring a forklift to the gym and I could lift any amount of weight that I wanted with the forklift, but that's not the point. The point is you're doing the work so that you strengthen the muscle. This is your most important muscle, your brain. If you're not doing the work, if it's just a prompt into ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, or whatever, you can get there faster, but you're not learning anything at all. So I'm a big believer in AI. Smart use of it's really good, but don't outsource the development of critical thinking to it. That's a big problem. And then the third and final thing I'd say is a line that I mentioned before with my kids: jump in the deep end, pick things up and try them. What's the worst that could happen? Most of the time, the worst that could happen is it hurts a little bit, but not too much. So screw around, screw up, play, see what happens. That's the advice I would give.
Scott, I have to say I really enjoyed our time here today. And I forgot to mention to our listeners that you're a big fan of the Robert Frost poem, The Road Not Taken, where yellow gets its inspiration. We talked about that at the black tie event at Thinkers 50. Thank you so much for your time here today. If people are interested in finding more about you, Epic Disruptions, how might they do so?
You mentioned LinkedIn, so that is the place where I live my life on social media. So just look for Scott Anthony Tuck, Tuck. Lest you find the Scott Anthony who also has written a book called Profits from the Pie about growing your pizza business. I cannot help you with that, but Epic Disruptions and my other work can help you with a bunch of other things. There is also a companion website to the book, epicdisruptions.com. That is plural because there are 11 chapters. But William, this has been a super fun conversation. I feel like we could go on for hours and hours and hours, but appreciate all the great questions and discussion.
Scott, thank you so much for joining the Workplace Podcast.
Thanks again. Be well.
Thanks so much for listening to the Workplace Podcast in association with Dynamic Partners. We really appreciate you being part of the conversation. Want to start the conversation about leadership in your organization? At Dynamic Partners, we help leaders and teams build a culture of performance that drives real results. Visit dynamicpartners.ie to find out more about our workshops and coaching services, or email info@dynamicpartners.ie to start the conversation. We're ambitious for your leadership. Are you?